Hello, welcome back to the Fractional Typology Project. My name is Tita Koshi, and today we're going to be covering Ladybug from Bullet Train, specifically in Socionics. And beware, as there are spoilers ahead. Now, I want to say up front, Socionics is probably the most, well, I don't know if I want to call it the most dense and hard to understand system of the 10 systems that I cover, but it can be difficult. So if any of the terms don't make sense, please go back and cross-reference the introduction to the FTP. I very thoroughly explained the elements of Model A that I use in this video in that video. So please, if any of it's confusing, go back and refer to that. So these are Ladybug's Socionics votes. Pretty definitively in favor of SEI, but that is actually below 80%. And there's some strong votes for ESI and SLI. So, first off, what is the most likely base function, which in Socionics is the first function? In my opinion, of the information elements, the clearest one for Ladybug is socio-SI, which is about seeking comfort. I think that the piece that Ladybug tries to seek throughout the movie can be understood pretty handily in the frame of seeking comfort. Now, if you have base socio-SI, there are two functions that you end up, well, there are two types that have base socio-SI. SEI, which is like ISFJ, and SLI, which is like ISTJ. Now, because the naming convention in Socionics is different, they'd be like ISF lowercase p and IST lowercase p, but the principle's the same. They both have SI, and then they either have FE second or TE second. So, to cross-compare them, best way to cross-compare these types, in my opinion, and we'll talk about my bias for me doing it this way a little later into the video, but I like to compare their creative function, which is their second function, to their vulnerable function, which is their fourth and weakest function, because I think this provides the best contrast between these types. Now, if we go back, we'll notice that SLI has a decent amount of votes. But as you can see here, Socio-TE is all about practical facts and practical data. Ladybug notably sucks with this in the movie. He can't get El Saguaro's name right. Calls him like El Sbarro and all this other stuff. And an SLI not only uses those practical facts second, their vulnerable function is emotional expression. And given the high votes for SEI, given the mistaken 7 fix in the tri-type, I don't think very few people look at Ladybug and say emotional expression is his weakest problem. A good example of an SLI is Joe, Officer K, from Blade Runner 2049, the one that Ryan Gosling plays. There is a natural stoicism to vulnerable socio-FE, at least in that context. That can be much more easily related to vulnerable socio-FE than anything that Brad Pitt does as Ladybug in Bullet Train. Meanwhile, not only can you make, I think, a decent case for creative socio-FE, as, Ladybug does emotionally participate with the people he talks to, attempts to evoke emotions in XYZ way, but Ladybug is also pretty bad with details. So the case for that is not bad, not bad at all. Um, so now alternatively, right? This is the alternative. What about base socio-FI? You know, base socio-FI is valuing your close relationships. Can you make the argument that that's what Ladybug is doing? Now, base socio-FI, again, there are two types that have base socio-FI. ESI, which is like ISFP, or EII, which is like INFP. Basically, do they have SE second or NE second? Now, it's an interesting thing here. I'll let you read here for a second before I pop back up. So we have to contextualize this in terms of Ladybug's use of force. Again, there are some decent proponents for ESI. If we go back, that is, you know, one of the highly voted alternatives. And it's also, you know, the fact that I think that Ladybug is an ISFP, and that in terms of, you know, directly mapping functions from the four-letter system to socionics, ESI is FISE, but in socionics. Now, I don't believe that Ladybug is ISFP in both. I think there are ISFPs that are ISFP in both. I think that Yuichi Kimura, the father, is a good example of an ISFP ESI. And one of the big things here is creative socio-SE. Socio-SE is about force and about using force to accomplish what you want to accomplish. And that is the opposite of what Ladybug does. You know, your creative function is the most helpful thing that you lean on to accomplish the goal of your base function. And Ladybug does not use force that often. Ladybug can use force, but he does not use it often enough for it to be a creative function. Alongside that, Ladybug, I think, is too open-minded, too considerate of the opinions and orientations of others to be vulnerable socio-NE. Now, to cross-compare this with EII, which I think is the stronger case, you know, instead of you know, ESI ignoring and having id block socio-SI, EII actually values socio-SI and comfort, which I think is a closer fit. Now, that being said, EII has vulnerable socio-SE, so using force is the weakest thing. And people who actually had vulnerable socio-SE, I think, would be incapable of the kind of force that Ladybug uses in self-defense. So I think comparing Ladybug to legitimate EIIs, it just doesn't work. And that's a big reason why, you know, obviously, you know, I've stated how, you know, there's no real evidence for NE in Ladybug's behavior. So obviously creative socio-NE doesn't really work. But the real issue, in my opinion, is Ladybug is far too comfortable with the use of socio-SE and with force for it to be his most vulnerable function. And I think to compare and contrast against characters that are more EII adjacent, you see that dissonance. So what about the other SEI functions? So this is very relevant. So far I've mentioned 3 of the SEI functions. By the way, if it wasn't clear, I do think that SEI is a better option for what Ladybug is than EII. But I've only mentioned the base function, the creative function, and the vulnerable function. So what about the other SEI functions in Model A? So first of all, role socio-NI. So the role function is something that you can lean into and kind of do, but only for so long. because it's kind of against your core nature. And I think that you can make the argument that Ladybug does um, lean into trying to figure out the dynamics and predictions in terms of how the train goes, um, but only for so long. So I think you can make that argument. The other two are harder. I don't think there's any good evidence that Ladybug values socio-NE or socio-TI. So the way that Model A works is your super id block, your fifth and your sixth function, are the things that you value most in another person. And these are um, a carryover from Austria Augusta's legitimate priorities when making socionics as a system. So I think when Austria made Model A in socionics, it was partly to figure out why people interact the way that they do. And relationship compatibility was a strong part of its design. So a fourth of the functions in Model A are dedicated to what you desire in other people. And so an SEI who majors in their ego block in SI and FE values the opposite in other people, NETI. Um, and sometimes that dynamic really does play out in fictional and I guess real examples. But in this case, it doesn't. Like, I don't see any good evidence um, that he values either of those things. I think there's much stronger evidence that he values socio-NI and socio-SI. So, as far as the other functions are concerned, these two functions are in the id block, SE and FI, meaning that they are ignored and only leaned on if they need to be. That is actually a great way of describing his orientation with socio-SE, funny enough. The idea that he is capable of this kind of force and capable of it easily, but neglects it completely in order to focus on what he actually wants, which is his base socio-SI, is really fitting for how he interacts with force. Socio-FI is a much harder sell. I think that Ladybug values his personal relationships much more than he values evoking emotions in others. And I think that evoking emotions in others contradicts the kind of peace and levelness that I think he's actually attempting to create. There's also the big focus from Ladybug on, quality people and the right relationships. And I think that's much more compliant to socio-FI than socio-FE. So I think that the case for SEI is stronger, but there is that sort of difficult to shake thing of his prioritization of socio-FI over these other things. And we'll get into that in a second, that sort of dissonance and where that places the questions and inconsistencies. So, a couple of things with just considering SEI. Socio-SI is mainly a thing that refers to physical comforts, and I think that while I think that Ladybug appreciates physical comforts, I think that he is attempting to reach a broader emotional and abstract peace. That isn't really a thing in socionics in terms of the way that its information elements hedge at human behavior. SEI is definitely the closest of those, but even then, it is a bit of a weak case there. So I think when we get to a character that actually prioritizes purely physical comforts, the dissonance between that character and Ladybug would showcase the way in which stretching socio-SI in this kind of way is kind of insufficient. Additionally, I think you can make the argument that they use creative socio-FE. I think that the argument that they have vulnerable socio-FE is a much harder argument to make. But in terms of what they actually did and whether or not it was emotional manipulation, I think that you can make the argument in most cases that it's either a more intimate and honest expression, more reminiscent of dominant FI in and of itself, or even base socio-FI, right? Or that they're a byproduct of quick thinking, of SE resourcefulness and improvisation in the moment. And I think that that is a valid argument, and I think that it's harder to pin socio-FE to him over socio-FI. Now, that brings us to this, typing bias. So I have a thing where how do I put this? I so and I just have to I had to take a step back here for a second. Socionics is very dense, and there's a lot of moving parts, and I had a good enough understanding of the way that Model A could gel together to make effective arguments for a bundle of 16 characters that did justice to what Model A is trying to do. Um, However, Model A is not phenomenological. It's not an underlying thing. I don't believe that people are cleanly SEI, EII, etc. I think that socionics, like all typology, is a tool of language that we try to use to talk about how people actually are in an underlying sense. And because of that, I think that socionics, in its ambitiousness, bundles a lot together into a space where maybe all those things shouldn't be directly interlinked. Who's to say that socio-SI cannot occur with socio-FI? And there are characters that actively have this debate. Toriel from Undertale is a good example. People use subtype arguments to say, oh, the reason why they can use SI and FI is that they're a harmonizing SEI, which means that they use socio-FI over socio-FE. And these kinds of additional concepts used to rationalize what I think is a deeper weakness in the system, that socionics bundles all these behaviors together and says this is humanity. And its ambitiousness with that makes it more specific and makes it say some pretty interesting things over the way in which the four-letter system can be very general about, all values, for introverted feeling versus specifically personal relationships and socio-FI. But that same specificity that can make it commentate on deeper underlying phenomena can also be the double-edged sword that makes it too specific to fit cleanly in a lot of examples. And unfortunately for socionics, Ladybug is one of those cases that I think drives that kind of tension and showcases an area where socionics struggles to put the pieces together. And that's just talking about Model A. That's just talking about the difficulties with Model A. So anyway, I'm sort of getting ahead of myself. Because of these challenges, I have a bias to type mostly from the first, second, and fourth function. The first and second function are the ego block. They're the thing that the type is strongest at, and they're the thing that's the most consistently present. The fourth function is the thing that the type is weakest at. And so I think that you can find out a lot about the compatibility of a character to the broader socionics type via those three functions. But you'll also note that, I'll weight them pretty highly, but then say, the id block is whatever, and, the super id block isn't always going to fit. Like EII has valuing socio-SI. So, in that sense, it seems to be a better fit. But the vulnerable function, base function, and creative function mattered more to me in terms of typing um, than the super id block. And of course, I'm not definitively calling Ladybug an SEI, so it's not that big of a deal. But it's also a thing to recognize about the way that I consider Model A, that I tend to bias those more in typing because they are the more uh, dominant characteristics in terms of what the type is. But the types in socionics are a lot. To refer back to my other category here, um, a lot of concepts in socionics: relationship compatibility, physical traits descended from type, as well as subtraits like the Riemann dichotomies. Um, if I were to, there are 16 Riemann dichotomies. And if I were to type the 16 Riemann dichotomies in every video I did, it would not only be very boring, it would also be very counterproductive because I've already looked at the Riemann dichotomies enough to know that they don't really map at scale as cleanly and mathematically as socionics theory would like to imply. And this is where where I pulled out a little Karl Popper here, who was a very active critic of unfalsifiable pseudosciences. He did critiques of Marxism and Freudian theories as unscientific because their theories would elaborate on themselves with more and more layers in ways that were not falsifiable, and there was always another layer that they could use to justify. Um, this is Popper referred to these as immunizing tactics and ad hoc hypotheses. And cynically speaking, the layers of socionics can feel like this. Now, that being said, um, I do want to say that socionics does have some very interesting concepts. And again, I am not referring to them as an underlying phenomena in people as much as like an interesting concept in language that sometimes has some good overlap and sometimes stretches too far. The problem with the layers and ambitiousness of socionics as a system is that it very frequently stretches too far, especially when you consider the inevitable physical traits that emerge from type or subsystems like subtypes and the Riemann dichotomies. Um, it's harder to justify. And because it's harder to justify, I also think it's less relevant to talk about. Because my goal here isn't really to tear open the ways that typology doesn't work. If that was really my goal, then I would talk more about systems that I think struggle to keep their consistency, like horoscopes and zodiac. Instead, I want to talk about where the language of typology does describe something kind of fitting, and also to refine where it's really fitting versus where it's only kind of fitting. Like how I talked about socio-SI, physical comforts versus a broader emotional and abstract piece. But this critique of socionics is implicit and enduring, because every time I talk about socionics, there needs to be that sort of disclaimer that there's a lot of baggage that comes with this system. It's very ambitious, but doesn't always pan out in the most productive way. So now to talk about Maria and Ladybug's relationship with Maria. So Ladybug wants comfort, and so does Maria. Maria is an LSE, which is ESTJ in socionics, which means that they have creative socio-SI and can relate to Ladybug's desire for comfort. However, there are some tension points, but they're not such serious tension points that they actually matter. Maria is third emotion, not comfortable with her emotions, but LSE would also suggest that she's suggestive socio-FI, which means that she desires close relationships with others. This kind of mix, I think, endears her to the um, tenderness and genuine care that Ladybug gives, even if she does not reciprocate it in words or emotional affect. Additionally, she's great with details. Details are her main thing, and that manifests in the four-letter system as dominant SI, but manifests in socionics as base socio-TE. However, with vulnerable socio-TE, Ladybug is the worst with details, but this doesn't seem to cause that much of an issue with their relationship and dynamic, which is good for the both of them. So, next is Lemon. Lemon is to address this, and I actually commentated, I think, on this in the four-letter video as I was thinking stuff through. It seems like the beta STs, which are ISTPs and ESTPs in socionics, have a distaste for Ladybug. And in making this presentation, I realized a good reason why is that they have ignoring socio-SI. To have socio-SE in their top two in their ego block, it means that they discard and don't really care about comfort. Now, the elder is like this too, but the elder prioritizes personal relationships in such a way that makes them appreciate the thing that Ladybug cares about. So despite Lemon and Ladybug wanting similar things to some extent, I don't think Lemon respects what Ladybug fundamentally wants. And only after being corrected by the Elder, another socio-SE user, much closer dispositionally to Lemon, does he see the error of his ways, at least in part, and apologize. Tangerine, again, does not respect Ladybug's approach of comfort. Tangerine and Ladybug have an inverse dynamic here where, base socio-SE, he ignores comfort. Base socio-SI, he ignores force. And so they play off each other in a way that annoys each other. Tangerine wants to kill him. Tangerine wants to kill him and does not care. Also, I don't know if I sort of allowed you to read these slides. The prince, again, does not comprehend Ladybug, I think, in a deeper way. She uses her own manipulative tactics, which in my opinion are tertiary FE and role socio-FE. But because she doesn't understand his move for comfort, she doesn't understand how he wouldn't have been an effective gunman against the White Death. The Elder, sees this comfort mentality and is sympathetic to it in a way that makes them immediately amiable. And the White Death doesn't care. Again, brushing off the socio-SI is something stupid and weak. I think I would make the argument that his son is an SLI. So to the degree that both of them are comfort seekers, I think that White Death would view both of them as weak fundamentally. Which I think is partially why he got so mad at the end. He's like, "Do not call me bro." It's like he doesn't want to be related to the idea of being what Ladybug fundamentally is, which is a pawn, being moved as an operative for someone else's broader scheme. The idea of having no control whatsoever, Ladybug gives up the idea of control, wants to, have peace in this broader abstract sense. That is death to the White Death. That is the last thing they want. And so to be called bro means to relate to that in that kind of way. And, you know, I think the White Death definitely took that personally. So these are examples of SEI and EII characters. You'll probably recognize Pam Beasley and Remus Lupin from the Introduction to the FTP video. Shaggy and Mob are good examples. Now, there are almost no gold tier EIIs on the database. One of the gold tier EIIs I don't even agree with. It's Todd Anderson from Dead Poet Society. I left a note on their profile explaining why I don't think they're a good fit for socio-FI. Socio-FI is a focus on relationships, personal relationships, and that is not the thing that centers Todd Anderson. Instead, I think that, vulnerable socio-SE fits for Todd Anderson. There's no way that anyone would view him as an ESI. He struggles to evoke emotions in others, so IEI is off the table. And so people pretty clearly come to EII as the best fit, but it's not. It's not a good fit. But Mob and Shaggy are both majority IXFPs, majority 9s. Shaggy is a 9-wing 8, debated for a 6-wing 7, but, voted mostly ISFP, little ESFP in there. And then Mob is a, INFP, pretty good 9-wing 1 votes. A little bit of debate, I think, for 6-wing 5. But either way, both of them are in the same area of introverted feelers who are at least majority sort of dominant in their feelings and care for other people and try to be kind in the way that 9s often are. And that makes them good to compare and contrast when you're considering which category Ladybug better fits in. And I do think they better fit SEI than EII, but I also think there's some fundamental problems with calling them a straight up SEI, which is why I put the question mark in the thumbnail and why I've done this cross comparison, because, I think that while being a best fit for SEI, that Ladybug showcases why SEI has some weaknesses as a broader term, or at least, can effectively describe some characters wholly, but with Ladybug, for the reasons I mentioned before, it struggles. So, but that is everything. So I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.